Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Horkheimer. Today we're going to finish the first Excursus, the one about Odysseus and the myth of enlightenment. So last time, if you remember, we argued that cunning, which is Odysseus's trademark, cunning is instrumental reason. It stems from the practice of sacrifice, and we said that, well, this kind of proves that sacrifice is not irrational, like enlightenment argues, but it is enlightenment. Its point is to be able to control nature through a bargaining, or more accurately, to cheat nature. You make nature think that you have submitted to her, that you embraced her through the act of sacrifice, but in reality, you are getting the legitimacy to cheat and exploit nature. As they say, the formula for Odysseus's cunning is that the detached instrumental mind, by submissively embracing nature, renders to nature what is hers and thereby cheats her. So by cheating here, we mean that you don't give to someone what they are owed, like I owe you some money, but if I manage to keep the money while making you think that I gave you what I owe you, then I cheated you. The point of sacrifice is making nature think that she got what she's owed. And so that's why Odysseus accepts to submit to nature, that he doesn't try to avoid the forces of nature, which are represented by the mythical creatures that he encounters. So the creatures, as the authors say, represent nature's due. The mythical monsters under whose power he falls represent, as it were, petrified contracts and legal claims dating from primeval times. So whenever a monster emerges, it is a representation of nature claiming its due. So a sacrifice must be made so that Odysseus can survive those monsters. But normally, he shouldn't be able to survive. The only sacrifice that would satisfy nature is the sacrifice of the self. But we have established that it is precisely that which Odysseus doesn't want to give up. So cheating nature means also cheating fate. Nature becomes the same as an abstract fate imposed on human beings from which they cannot escape, because they are bound to nature by some sort of contract. So nature has a legal claim on the self. So Odysseus must give something else instead of his self, but must be somehow equivalent enough to satisfy the gods or these mythical creatures. Hence, the mythical creatures are not like it is often interpreted, like the contrast between the power of nature and the feeble technology of human beings, like you have the force of the oceans in contrast to the little ship sailing on it. Instead, the authors argue that it is a legal relationship. At one point in the Odyssey, Odysseus is obliged to go through Scylla and Charybdis, the two monsters on each side of the Strait of Messina, between Sicily and Calabria. And these monsters, they eat whomever sails too close to them. So Odysseus cannot avoid them if he wishes to go home, which is his goal. And so they have a legal claim on whatever comes close to their teeth. And so likewise, the episode with the sorceress Circe, they argue that she too had a legal claim on the man she turns into pigs. And the famous Cyclope, Polyphemus, also has a claim on whomever enters his cave. And so these creatures only do one thing. They are claiming their due. Hence their repetitive nature and their relationship to fate. Like fate, they are inevitable and always repeat themselves. They must be satisfied no matter what, over and over again, like there is no escape from them. Hence, whenever someone is caught trying to cheat their way out of the legal relationship with these creatures, gods or nature, they are sent to Tartarus. Now, the Tartarus is like the equivalent of hell in Greek mythology. It's like an underground prison in the depths of the earth, where prisoners are tortured for eternity by repeating again and again one absurd task. Among the famous prisoners are Tantalus. Tantalus was punished by being forced to stand on a riverbank under a tree, and so whenever he is hungry, he tries to reach for the fruits hanging from the tree branches, but the tree branches, they go up, so he cannot reach them. And whenever he's thirsty, he tries to drink from the water at his feet, but the water retrieves. So he spends an eternity being hungry and thirsty. Then there is Sisyphus, who is forced to roll a boulder up on a hill, only to see it roll back down as he's about to reach the top. So he must start all over again. And then the authors mention the Danaids. These are figures who are forced to fill with water a bathtub that has no bottom. And so these punishments, they represent the inevitability of fate, but also the lack of discipline of the culprit. Their mistake was that they give in to their impulses, and so they become figures of compulsion. Their punishment is to be compelled to do what they failed to do forever. It is a reinforcement of the contract that they failed to honor. Quote, mythical inevitability is defined by the equivalence between the curse, the abominable act which expiates it, and the guilt arising from that act, which reproduces the curse. All law in history up to now bears the trace of this pattern. So this pattern means that there is an ongoing guilt that the subject must pay for. Nature is always claiming its due, and the more the subject postpones or cheats, the bigger the guilt and the charge. So what Odysseus is fighting against is this guilt. He wants to break free from fate, which is inevitable. So the fight of Odysseus is the fight of the self against fate, or the rational universality against the inevitability of fate. With rationality, Odysseus hopes that he can cheat fate. The problem is that he realizes that the rational universality and the inevitability of fate are intertwined. You cannot have one without the other. So you have to submit to fate if you want to escape from it. So Odysseus accepts to go through Scylla and Charybdis. He accepts to pass by the island of the Sirens. He knows that he cannot avoid them, and he knows that if he listens to them, he will submit completely and swim to his death. And so therefore he must use his cunning. How can I give nature what it wants without giving it what it wants? How can I defy what cannot be defied? And so that's what cunning is. As they write, cunning, however, is defiance made rational. So Odysseus succumbs to nature, to the songs of the sirens, but he manages to come out from it. He survives, and so he respected the deal of the bargain. Like, here, nature, I gave you what you wanted. I succumbed to the songs of the sirens, so you cannot ask anything more of me. I earned my right to continue my journey. So basically, Odysseus is the lawyer who finds loopholes in a contract. Odysseus basically argues, you said that I have to listen to the sirens, but you never specified that I have to listen to them untied to the mast of my ship. So from there, technological awareness enters the picture. Technology starts with the mast and the ropes. With technology, I can use nature against nature. I can find the loopholes and cheat my way out of the contract without breaking the contract. So the contract requires that I acknowledge the superiority of the siren songs. I did that, so you cannot demand anything else. So Odysseus succumbs without succumbing and doesn't succumb while he succumbs. And so in this way, he manages to neutralize the power of the sirens, the demigoddesses. And so the power in question is, of course, desire and impulse. Odysseus keeps his desire to listen to the song, but that desire doesn't consume him. As such, both nature in the external world and the internal world, which is, desires and impulses, they are neutralized while acknowledged. In other words, he manages to make them safe, to make his desires safe. And as such, Odysseus found the perfect formula to make all parties happy. Nature gets to sing her song and ignite the desires in the listeners, so she has her due, while the listeners the listener keeps his self. Since the contract was respected, the subject can do whatever he wants to nature now. Nature cannot complain since she got what she was asking for. Now we can also ask the question, what about the sailors? Because if you remember, the sailors didn't listen to the song since their ears were filled with wax. So technically the sailors did not respect their part of the bargain. This probably can mean that no one cares what happens to them. They can be thrown to the sirens or the Furies later on. The Furies are the goddesses of vengeance. So what Odysseus really sacrifices is his sailors. Like for Odysseus to listen to the sirens and to survive the sirens, he has to make his sailors break the contract, which means that he turned them into Danaans. So Odysseus also gains his life by offering that of his companions as sacrifice to nature. But the authors don't go into that. Rather, they focus on the sirens. They say, well, what about the sirens, however? Because they say the epic does not say what happens to the singers, the sirens, once the ship has passed. But in a tragedy, this would have been their last hour, as it was for the Sphinx when Oedipus solved the riddle, fulfilling her command and thereby causing her downfall. So, the part with Oedipus is revealing because since once Oedipus solved the riddle of the Sphinx, remember the riddle, what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon and 3 legs at night, and Oedipus said it's men, like babies walk on 4 legs, adults on 2, and old people on 3 since they use a cane. So once Oedipus solved that riddle, he gave the Sphinx his due, and so the Sphinx couldn't complain, if Oedipus kills it. And so the point is that since the mythical creatures represent strength, they cannot be defeated by strength. They must be, we must use cunning to defeat them. And once we do, they simply disappear from the world. Nature loses its strength in the face of cunning. But what cunning does is fulfilling the demands of nature. That's what's important. Like the cheating is done through the satisfaction of the demands of nature. Once nature gets what it wants by cunning, it is game over for her. And so this later becomes the favorite tool for social control. Once the masses have what they desire through comfort and technology, well, they are finished. The ruling class can kill them like Oedipus did to the Sphinx and Odysseus did to the songs of the sirens, and also maybe his own companions. As they write, since the hapless meeting of Odysseus with the sirens, all songs have ailed. The whole of Western music suffers from the absurdity of song and civilization, yet the motive force of all art music is song. So, what's this deal with song and music? Well, to understand this, we need to look at the next paragraph of the Excursus, which is about language as designation. This is something that happens to language once the contract we talked about vanishes once it is fulfilled. So what does this mean? Well, if you remember from the chapter of Concept of Enlightenment, we said that in the magical phase, the word and the object coincided. And in the mythical phase, they started to be distinguished from one another. But still in myth, they remained linked to a certain degree, and it is this relationship between word and object that makes fate possible in the first place. Like the fact that I am a certain thing means that I will have a specific word related to my essence. And as such, the spoken word, since it is directly related to the object, becomes an expression of fate. Quote, mythical fate had been one with the spoken word. Within the sphere of ideas in which mythical figures executed the unalterable edicts of fate, the distinction between word and object was unknown. The word was thought to have direct power over the thing, expression merged with intention. Cunning, however, consists in exploiting the difference. So it's like in the mythical phase, people maybe began to be aware that the two were confused because they were experiencing fate in a different way than with magic. We will come back to this, and then the epic. Well, we actually begin in the epic. We begin to separate word and object. The separation means that words can have different meanings. As a matter of fact, meaning is going to become completely detached from the object. It will become nothing but a convention. And this is what Odysseus is going to exploit to get himself out of messy situations. The famous example is of this is how he manages to escape from Polyphemus. Polyphemus, remember, he's the cyclops that eats humans, and Odysseus was confronted to him. And so how did he manage to escape? Well, he tricked him. When Odysseus met Polyphemus in his cave, Polyphemus told Odysseus and his crew that he is going to eat them, but then Odysseus was like, hey, don't you want to have wine while you eat us? We have some very fine wine in our ship. And so Polyphemus accepted and then asks Odysseus to bring him the wine, but he doesn't know Odysseus's name, so he asks, "What's your name?" And Odysseus says, "My name is Odysseus," which in Greek means two things: hero and nobody. So Odysseus says, "My name is nobody." And so he goes fetch the wine, and the Cyclops got so drunk that he fell asleep, and while sleeping, Odysseus stabs him in his eye. And so the Cyclops have just one eye, and so Polyphemus is now blind. Polyphemus and then Odysseus and his crew, they manage to escape by wearing some wool, because Polyphemus tries to catch them by touching by touch, since he cannot see. But he mistakes them for his sheep, because Cyclops, they are shepherds, they have sheep. It's Greek mythology, so don't ask. So Odysseus escapes, and Polyphemus calls the other Cyclops for help. And so they show up, and they're like, "Who blinded you? Who did this to you?" And Polyphemus says, "Nobody, nobody." So the others don't help him, since nobody blinded him. So by playing on the meaning of the word Odysseus, he manages to trick the monster. As the authors write, in his extremity, Odysseus becomes aware of dualism, as he discovers that an identical word can mean different things. Since the name Odysseus can mean either hero or nobody, the hero is able to break the spell of the name. So the spell of the name means fate. Odysseus is capable of escaping his fate from being eaten by the Cyclops once he disarms language. So this is where the distinction between fate in magic and in myth comes in. In magic, the spoken word was indeed related to fate, but it was at the same time challenging it. Since we talked about how the magicians imitates the same powers without identifying with them, he had more autonomy than when the priest only makes the distinction between word and object in order to become fate. So in the magical phase, you can say that there was a dialectical play between word and object. The opposition between the two, which was recognized in magic, was dialectical, but in the Homeric narrative, the opposition becomes decisive, like we just want to keep them apart. And the reason why we keep them apart is so that it gives more power to the subject over the object. Once words become conventions, then it is no longer fate that decides, but we decide on what objects are and what to do with them. So the capacity to make words arbitrary means that we become the designators. We can manipulate language as we want. We can make one word designate multiple objects. This is called formalism. What matters is the form, the word, and not the content. By manipulating the form, we get power over the content. And so that's what Odysseus discovers. By controlling the forms, by controlling the words, he can even control the primeval powers of nature and the gods. Odysseus discovered in words what in fully developed bourgeois society is called formalism. Their perennial ability to designate is but at the cost of distancing themselves from any particular content which fulfills them, so that they refer from a distance to all possible contents, both to nobody and to Odysseus himself. And from formalism emerges nominalism, which we already explained many times, and from nominalism, well, you get to bourgeois thinking. For bourgeois thinking, everything can be designated by the same word, since there are no intrinsic links between things and objects. And so the direct consequence is that nothing can be distinguished from anything anymore. All of nature and all of its phenomenon become identical. And as such, nature cannot complain about anything that happens to her, because there would be no difference between Odysseus's submission to nature, to Polyphemus, and Polyphemus or nature's submission to Odysseus. So the meaning of the word nobody is revealing, since even existence and non-existence become one and the same. Quote, he declares allegiance to himself by disowning himself as nobody. He saves his life by making himself disappear. The adaptation to death through language contains the schema of modern mathematics. So this is all about how people in bourgeois society give up their individuality. They give up on it. They literally become nobodies in order to survive, in order to preserve their selves. But since they are disowning themselves, well, what they're actually doing is adapting to death. Like, I cannot live, so I will just make my life as indistinguishable from death. That way the superpowers of nature and the gods will leave me alone. I cannot live, so I will adapt to death. And so the schema of modern mathematics is how that adaptation is carried through. I give myself up to rational equations and numbers. The number simply replaces the name, which, you know, the number can be applied and designate everything. Under numbers, under quantity, everything is indistinguishable and everything can be designated. And as such, it becomes easy to cheat the other party through contract. If nothing is distinguishable from anything, then whomever gets cheated cannot complain, since the exchange is valid. The principle of equivalence then allows for everything to be the same. Once you reach that sameness, the only criterion for validity is who has more power. And so it's like the scam of equality of opportunity. You are all giving the same starting line. The turtle and the rabbit start at the same level, since they are considered to be the same. And so in that situation, what is going to distinguish between them is simply who runs faster. In other words, who has power over the other. And so in the context of Odysseus, this is called the ancient practice of occasional exchange. So what is occasional exchange? It's a practice in which two self-sufficient households exchange surplus. Surplus is the part of production that is not going to be consumed out of need. It's in contrast to provisions. They quote Max Weber there, who said, surpluses are occasionally exchanged, but provisions are predominantly produced by the consumers themselves. So, because it is a surplus that is occasionally exchanged, it is therefore a social marker. Those who have surplus are more powerful than those who don't. So the term occasional means that it is only those who can get out of the economic restrictions, those who don't have to worry about food or shelter, only those can partake in this practice. So it is occasional because it is not a practice that you will see in the majority, and it is something in contrast to most economic activities. Slaves and workers are the ones who partake in the economy. They are the ones who produce the food, the shelters, the tools, but they remain at the bottom, rarely escaping the demands of the market or the economy. In contrast, you have the figure of the traveler and the merchant. These figures don't stay within the domestic economic spheres, but precisely get their wealth from outside that sphere. And as such, he is seen as the adventurous one who goes against tradition, against the established norms, throws himself into nature and onto the sea, and then comes back with untold wealth. So we see here the typical element of the Robinsonade. A Robinsonade is a tale about a shipwreck, and then the individual manages to survive and eventually gets back to civilization, but stronger and healthier than before. It's named after Robinson Crusoe. He is a weak human being who has to use his reason, his cunning, to dominate and exploit nature. It's the tale of the weaker one wins over the strong one. Like mind beats strength, but mind does so by cheating. And that is the force of cunning. As such, cunning has an irrational side to it. It doesn't abide by the rules. It is constantly looking for ways to break them. It therefore takes unreasonable risks, throws itself against the odds, and still manages to come off victorious. So they are alone, atomized individuals, cut off from the collective, and they must survive on their own. And by doing so, they assert even more their superiority over the collective, and even the priority of their own personal and individual economic interests over those of the collective too. And so Adorno and Horkheimer write about Odysseus and Crusoe. The lone voyager armed with cunning is already Homo economicus, whom all reasonable people will one day resemble. For this reason, the Odyssey is already a Robinsonade. Both these prototypical shipwreck sailors make their weakness, that of the individual who breaks away from the collective, their social strength. Abandoned to the vagaries of the waves, helplessly cut off, they are forced by their isolation into a ruthless pursuit of their atomistic interest. So, we find here the principle of capitalist economy and the prototype of the figure of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur is like Odysseus and Crusoe, a figure that steps outside the odds of domestic economy, and we don't know how, manages to bring back that incredible wealth. The wealth in question didn't originate from their physical strength, obviously, but we attribute its origin to something else, to their intelligence, or more precisely to their cunning, their ability to cheat the other party. They have the art of the deal, where with just their wit, they manage to get the most from you. So entrepreneurs don't have to know how to run the machines. They just need to convince you to work them and then give them what you produced. So in other words, you have elephants working for mice. The powerlessness of the entrepreneur legitimizes his social domination. Like the ignorance of the colonizer about the land they just arrived at legitimizes his domination over indigenous locals. So Odysseus is no different than this. The traveler racks the fruits of the locals under the guise of exchange in order to enrich his wealth at the expense of the local local places that he visits. Since he is the one powerless, then it is the indigenous, the masses, the slaves, the workers who have the advantage. If they find themselves serving him, then they deserve to lose. So this is the basis for the ideology of risk. We all know today that there is this myth of the entrepreneur who takes all of the risks and therefore he deserves to be paid more, has the right to keep the profit, the surplus value for himself. So he earned it since he took the risks. He went to the sea and he faced the Cyclops head on, armed with nothing more than his cunning. He was brave enough to take the road to success while you didn't. So you cannot complain. He has the right to do whatever he wants to you, like Odysseus to nature. So for the eyes of the entrepreneur, everyone else exists as a thing to be instrumentalized. Having cut off themselves and alienated themselves from others, the entrepreneurs cannot see in others anything else but means for their own particular interests. And as such, Odysseus and Crusoe are totalitarians. They represent the best model for social creatures to follow. The path to success is what allows creatures to preserve themselves, including societies. So therefore, the entire fabric of society must follow their example. Everything must be socialized to the core of the model of the entrepreneur and internalize their mindset. Quote, radical socialization means radical alienation. Both Odysseus and Crusoe deal in totality. The former measures it out, the latter fabricates it. They can do so only in total isolation from all other human beings, who appear to both men only in strange forms as enemies or allies, but always as instruments, things. So again, we have a social structure based on the designation principle in language. One thing designates everything else. The entrepreneur designates how everyone should be. So to go back to what we said about songs having ailed since Odysseus' encounter with the sirens, it means that songs have lost their strength, their ability to affect the listeners, or at least to draw them in with their affection. Odysseus is affected by the songs, but the songs have no power over him since he is bound to the mast. So he manages to make song inoffensive by destroying its language and by imposing his own language instead, a language of designation, a language of instrumental rationality. And as such, song becomes absurd and irrational. Therefore, music, as they said, suffers from the absurdity of song in civilization. Civilization views song as absurd and therefore music, and all of the arts, if you think about it, which stems from songs, they suffer and they are afflicted with that absurdity. They find themselves having to renounce to their own essence in order to please the interests of Odysseus. Now, songs have to please the interest of Odysseus, and so they have to empty themselves of their substance. So from there on, Adorno and Horkheimer, they address several episodes in the Odyssey where Odysseus does precisely that to every form of nature that he encounters. He turns them into inoffensive tool that works for his interest by neutralizing them. They go through 4 episodes: the Lotus Eaters, Polyphemus again, Circe, and then Odysseus' journey to Hades, the underworld. So let's start by the Lotus Eaters. The Lotus Eaters are a bunch of people who were identified as living on the island of Jerba in Tunisia, and they just get high all day by eating lotus flowers. So the reason why they start with this is because the Lotus Eaters, they represent something that dates way back, perhaps before ideas of demons and spirits and magic. That's because when someone eats from the food there, they are affected in the same way as the songs of the sirens affect you. But you actually don't die there. You die neither from the drug nor from the locals. As a matter of fact, the locals don't even think of harming anyone. But for Odysseus, there is something that is dangerously harmful in the drug. The only harm that comes from the drug is forgetfulness and loss of will. So basically, those who eat from the fruit of the plant, they start behaving like they are in the Garden of Eden. They forgot about their homes, their families, their duties, and just want to stay there, living off the lotus and remain in some sort of vegetative state of pure bliss. Now, something has to be said about this bliss. Well, it is a bad state, and Adorno and Horkheimer condemn it as such. They condemn it for 2 reasons. The first is that this ideal is, in their word, reminiscent of the bliss induced by narcotics, by which subordinates classes have been made capable of enduring the unendurable in ossified social orders. So this means that when you exploit people to make sure that they don't revolt, you put them in a state like that through drugs so that they become capable of enduring the exploitation and therefore they remain exploited. And the second reason is that this kind of bliss is an illusion that maintains human beings in an animal state. So it is not real happiness, as they say. At best, it would be an absence of the awareness of unhappiness. So you just don't know that you are miserable and that's it. That's not real happiness, because real happiness would require not that you forget suffering, but that you remove it altogether through action in a historical process. It's about working together towards a better society. And Odysseus does bring this up. He reminds his crew of their cause, that they have a utopia to realize and that they should endure suffering instead of just forgetting it. So the principle of self-preservation seems to be right in condemning the state of bliss of the Lotus Eaters. But, and here is the problem, Odysseus is not condemning the Lotus Eaters in order to liberate his crew from domination, but to assert his own domination. In being exerted by rationality, by Odysseus, this right is inevitably drawn into the realm of wrong. His immediate action is one which reasserts domination. So Odysseus literally even used force to get his men out of there and carry them to the ship while they were screaming and crying because they didn't want to leave. And then he had to tie them with iron chains. The lotus plant doesn't go well with the principle of self-preservation because it is a food that is reminiscent of prehistorical times, where the relationship with the earth was still immediate, like where people simply gathered the food by picking it up, as they say. Perhaps the temptation ascribed to it is no other than that of regression to the stage of gathering the fruits of the earth and sea, older than agriculture, cattle rearing, and even hunting older, in short, than any production. There's a footnote there that mentions Heinrich Zimmer, a German Indologist, so someone who studies South Asian cultures, and he argues that the lotus in Indian mythology is an earth goddess. The lotus flower is usually associated with the Orient. It is an Orient food commonly used in India and China. So these cultures often maintain a deep connection with the earth, with abundance, without necessarily having to work on farm in order to get food or even to hunt. So you'd have a lot of chthonic based cults there. Chthonic means what is in relation to the earth. In short, the lotus eating is reminiscent of maybe a matriarchal mindset where the earth was worshipped, and it promoted a lifestyle of leisure and idleness, and therefore it is mostly represented as a state of regress from the point of view of enlightenment. So it is a place from which Odysseus, being the prototype of the man of progress, must escape at all costs. The authors even mention the historian Jacob Reinhardt, who said that the lotus eaters, they live near the rim of the world. Like you try to distance yourself as much as possible from them because they remind us of that primal and prehistoric age. So the revolutionary potential of the lotus eaters is again neutralized like the Song of the Sirens. It is, as they write, a state in which the reproduction of life is independent of conscious self-preservation, the bliss of satiety uncoupled from the utility of planned nutrition. So the state is, this state is unacceptable for the ideology of enlightenment and must be transcended even by brute force. And this leads us to the next state. So the state after the one of the lotus eaters is the state of Polyphemus, the Cyclops. You already mentioned him, but here the authors go back to him. They say that Polyphemus is another stage in the primal world. He represents a later, truly barbaric age, one of hunters and shepherds. So in this stage, we don't have agriculture or production planning either, but it's not like the lotus eaters. In the lotus eaters, there is no harm that can be done to anyone, but in the times of the Cyclops, these creatures, they are fierce, they are uncivilized and violent. The word of the Cyclops is a word of abundance too. There is no need to plant anything or to grow anything. Fruits and animals are everywhere, and therefore the Cyclops need only to reach out to eat. But in a word of abundance, they grow violent and indifferent towards one another. It's a might makes right kind of world. So the Cyclops have no laws and live in hollow caves or caverns, and each Cyclops decides on what laws his wife and kids must follow. So we are talking about a patriarchal order in which the weak is suppressed by the strong. But also the lawlessness of the Cyclops is linked to another characteristic, their stupidity. The trick that Odysseus pulled on Polyphemus makes the other Cyclops unable to help him, so when Homer calls the Cyclops lawless-minded creatures, by lawless-minded, it's not that they don't have social or political laws or they don't care about those, but that their own thinking doesn't have any laws. In other words, the Cyclops have no logic. Their thinking is unsystematic and rhapsodic. It is undeveloped because they never had to develop it. They live in abundance and have always resorted to physical strength to settle any kind of matter. So when Odysseus comes to the cave with his crew, he reminds the Cyclops of a very important law and custom in Greek culture, xenophilia, which means hospitality. When a stranger comes to your home, you must welcome them and greet them appropriately, otherwise you will unleash Zeus's anger on you. So Zeus is the lawgiver who protects travelers. But Polyphemus tells Odysseus that he doesn't care about Zeus or their laws because they, the giants, the Cyclops are a race of giants, the giants are stronger than Zeus and the other gods. Now what does this mean? Well, in reality, for Adorno and Horkheimer, the Cyclops don't mean stronger like physically stronger, but they mean something else. We are stronger, Odysseus mockingly reports, but what the giant really meant was we are older. And this is true. In Greek mythology, the giants are older than the Olympian gods, and even if Polyphemus in particular is the giant son of an Olympian god, Poseidon, he is actually older than Zeus. So by a weird argument, Polyphemus is older than Zeus since his father is older than Zeus. Poseidon is older than Zeus. So what Polyphemus really says is that he represents an order that is older than the civilized world of Odysseus, and therefore he is stronger than Odysseus. So the confrontation between Polyphemus and Odysseus is a battle between elemental popular religion and logocentric religion of laws. So in other words, the story between Odysseus and Polyphemus is Homer telling everyone that if they don't follow logic, then they are barbarian or will never progress. So it's a call to reject the past, depicted as lawless, and to embrace progress, which means objective, rational laws. So there is a subtle denunciation of abundance, which means that a state of abundance is either a state of passivity, like the Lotus eaters, or violent barbarism and stupidity, like with the Cyclops. It is another way to neutralize the emphasis on physical strength to promote cunning. It is even the physical strength of Polyphemus that makes him have such feeble wits. He trusts Odysseus's claims immediately without even suspecting that there is a trick there. As they say, the physical crudity of the overpowerful creature is the source of his gullible trust. So the arrival of civilization then means progress in the sense of leaving this state and to create objective morality, laws, rationality, intelligence, and of course private property to enforce the respect of the neighbor. But just like the sirens, Polyphemus is not a villain. He is actually a sympathetic character. Like the authors argue that Homer wanted to draw a parallel between Odysseus and Polyphemus to show that Polyphemus isn't a bad guy, a bad giant like Goliath in Judaism. You know the biblical story of David and Goliath. Goliath is a Philistine giant warrior, and David manages to defeat him with just a rock. So you have another tale of physical strength that loses against a weak individual. But Polyphemus isn't like Goliath. Goliath is portrayed as just a villain, but not Polyphemus. The authors point to how Polyphemus tends to his sheep and seeks their sympathy after Odysseus blinds him. And so this scene is then paralleled with Odysseus when he comes home and finds his dog, Argus. Argus recognizes him. Now that means that Argus must be way over 20 years old, which is kind of impossible for a dog. But anyways, I mean Argus ultimately died right after he recognized Odysseus. So Polyphemus isn't a villain, but why? Why isn't he a villain? Well, because according to Adorno and Horkheimer, his arrogance and boastfulness is indeed the result of his stupidity and short-sightedness, and not of villainy. Like sure, we love it when some big bully gets his ass owned by the nerd, but that's because the bully is a villain. In the case of Polyphemus, he's just dumb, which means that acting differently doesn't really occur to him. It's not that he's bad, it's just that he doesn't acting differently doesn't occur to him. Like if he doesn't care about Zeus's law of xenophilia, it's not out of villainy, but because for him Zeus's law doesn't apply. So they say when Odysseus begs for hospitality, he does not reply simply with an expression of savage hatred, but only by refusing to respect a law which does not yet apply to him. He says merely that it would not occur to him to spare Odysseus and his companions. So Polyphemus must therefore accept to be outwitted by Odysseus, since the battle between him and Odysseus isn't one about good and evil, but which one knows better. So Polyphemus is simply following what he believes to be his right. Whomever enters his cave is his meal. This is not about evil or goodness, but about my right. I have a right to your flesh because you entered my domain. Anything else cannot come to his mind, and therefore it is within the very conditions that are set by Polyphemus that his downfall will happen. Hence, quote, Polyphemus and the other monsters that Odysseus outwits are models for the stupidity, litigious devils of the Christian era, right down to Shylock and Mephistopheles. Now, Shylock and Mephistopheles are two fictional characters. The former is from the Merchant of Venice, the comedy by Shakespeare, and the latter is a demon from the folk legend of Dr. Faust. So, Shylock was a Jewish merchant who claimed to have the right to a pound of flesh from one of the main characters of the play, and Mephistopheles is a demon who granted Faust unlimited knowledge and power in exchange for Faust's soul. It's a classic deal with the devil type scenario. But both these figures are modeled on Polyphemus. They are simply blind to anything else beyond their contract, beyond their rights. And as such, they cannot think of anything else, and therefore they're just stupid, and it is precisely this stupidity that causes their downfall. I mean, Mephistopheles does get Faustus' soul at the end, but he's still stupid in the sense that he doesn't care about what's not in the contract. And so likewise, Polyphemus too gets his ass handed to him because he doesn't think beyond his right. Odysseus acknowledges his right to eat human flesh and even encourages it, thus obtaining the trust of Polyphemus, a trust that he also gets by calling himself nobody. There is no point in fearing a nobody, so Odysseus plays by the rules of Polyphemus, and that's why he beats him. So he brings the wine to say to Polyphemus that he needs to drink a lot of wine to cherish the meal that he just had, and Polyphemus plays along. He doesn't realize that he's being played. He's actually incapable of realizing that. That is what culture does to nature. Odysseus, the bearer of culture, submits nature in the same way. So the parallel between Odysseus and Polyphemus is also important in a second perspective, and that is the context of mimesis. As we said, Odysseus didn't yet form his fixed identity yet. He is still living in an amorphous world, and that is what Polyphemus represents, a world with no identity, or at least a world where no identity has yet to be crystallized. So the play on word between the name Odysseus and nobody is revealing here. Like we said, in Greek, Odysseus and Eudeis, which is the word for nobody, sound very familiar. So when Odysseus says that his name is nobody, he is mimicking the world of Polyphemus. But it is precisely the rules of that world that helped Odysseus. The amorphous world is a world of magic. And like we said, in magic, there is no distinction between the word and the thing. And therefore, Polyphemus and the tribe of Cyclops, couldn't conceive that the word nobody means something else. And so this correspondence between the word and the thing is a characteristic of a word without identities. And this inability to conceive that words and things are different, the ability to conceive of the world as disenchanted, this is what turns the tables on Polyphemus. So because Odysseus denies his identity, he becomes like Polyphemus, and therefore enters a just context since he's now playing with the same rules. But his end game is to show how those same rules have brought the giant down to its knees, and by extension, the magical realm, and by further extension, nature. Quote, in reality, Odysseus, the subject, denies his own identity, which makes him a subject and preserves his life by mimicking the amorphous realm. He calls himself nobody because Polyphemus is not a self. A confusion of the name with the thing prevents the duped barbarian from escaping the trap. His cry for retribution remains magically tied to the name of the one on whom he wants to avenge himself, and this name condemns the cry to impotence. For by asserting his own intention into the name, Odysseus has withdrawn it from the magical sphere. But of course, there seems to be a contradiction, or at least a catch. Since Odysseus
survives by denying his own identity, then the magical realm has won, right? Like, magic doesn't really care if Polyphemus dies. What it cares about is that no firm identity gets asserted. So Odysseus, by claiming himself nobody, didn't defeat the magical realm, but is actually submitting to the thing that he hopes to escape. He wants to escape Polyphemus by adapting to Polyphemus's world. He may have survived physically, but he still has no identity whatsoever. His self-assertion as nobody is actually self-repudiation. The self is drawn back into the same compulsive circle of natural connections from which it sought through adaptation to escape. The man who, for the sake of his own self, calls himself nobody and manipulates resemblance to the natural state as a means of controlling nature gives way to hubris. So Odysseus' cunning and genius end up turning against him. In order to escape the thing that prevents him to assert his identity, he has to give up on his identity. So his genius turns out to be stupidity. The mimesis between the giant and the hero is also in the intellect as well. As soon as Odysseus leaves the cave of Polyphemus, he has the urge to reassert his identity as Odysseus, which his companions try to prevent him from doing because it will anger Poseidon. And so this is hubris. It is the sort of arrogance that gets a lot of Greeks killed, and Odysseus was committing it, and they barely made it out alive. It's like once he survived Polyphemus, he had to re-become Odysseus. He doesn't like to be nobody. He only did it to escape, only for pragmatic reasons, so he uses reason and cunning to survive the world of magic, but as soon as he's out of danger, he calls magic to reinstate his name as Odysseus. So the authors, as the authors say, he would fear to become nobody again if he did not re-establish his own identity by means of the magical world which rational identity had just superseded. The cunning by which the clever man assumes the form of stupidity reverts to stupidity as soon as he discards that form. That is the dialectic of eloquence. So the dialectic of eloquence is the process in which the more someone talks to be eloquent, the more their speech becomes absurd or garrulous. Homer, as the author's point, has been criticized for garrulousness. It means talkativeness, when someone talks a lot for no reason. But the garrulousness of Homer doesn't have a point, since it proves to be prophetically superior. It does allow Odysseus to preserve himself and survive the feast of the Cyclops. It is precisely the use of speech that saves Odysseus. So throughout the Odyssey, Odysseus is being acclaimed over and over for his eloquence, his mastery of speech and language, because it is through that he beats opponents. And for that reason, Odysseus cannot stop talking. If he goes silent, he will perish. If he keeps talking, he will commit hubris and bring the hatred of Poseidon on him, but if he remains silent, he will end up in Polyphemus' stomach. Hence, he needs to keep talking, and the more he talks, the more he learns to be eloquent, which means that the more he learns that he can manipulate his overpowered enemies. So he needs to maintain the distance between words and things, and he does it through eloquence and garrulousness. Odysseus, like the enlightened man, wants to do to nature what nature does to him, and therefore he only disenchants it in order to mimic nature and gain power over it. So in other words, he doesn't want his thought to mimic nature, he wants nature to mimic his thought. So he wants to be in control of nature, to reproduce on nature what nature does on him. If nature is working through magic, so Odysseus wants to take away magic, but in order to place it in himself. So how does speech allow him to do that? Well, speech allows Odysseus to put order into thought, to have laws of thinking, unlike Polyphemus. The problem is that in magic, both thought and reality are synonymous. So to make sure that nature doesn't dominate Odysseus, Odysseus needs to keep these two spheres separate. Thought and reality are no longer synonymous. But this doesn't allow Odysseus to have the power he seeks, so he needs to make them again synonymous, but without losing himself. And so this is what speech can do. It's a parody of thought. He wants his thought to have power over nature, so he needs to keep them at a distance, but also he must reconcile them in order for that power to be effective. And so that's what speech does. Its spate accompanies the stream of consciousness, thought itself like a parody. Thought's unwavering autonomy takes on a moment of manic folly when it enters reality as speech, as if thought and reality were synonymous, whereas the former has power over the latter only through distance. So, if thought enters reality as speech, then it will take the kind of manic folly that we find in mimesis. And so we will have the impression that thought and reality are once again synonymous, but in reality they keep their distance. And just like that, thought becomes the one controlling and dominating reality, meaning nature. So Odysseus finds himself obliged to keep talking, since it is only with speech that he can control nature and survive. With the power of speech, he can make Polyphemus experience the same violence and fear that Odysseus was experiencing from Polyphemus. It's like speech is man's way to tell nature, have a taste of your own medicine. Quote, for this reason, the astucious hero is always tempted to ignore the proverbial wisdom that silence is golden. He is driven objectively by the fear that if he does not constantly uphold the fragile advantage the word has over violence, this advantage will be withdrawn by violence. For the word knows itself to be weaker than the nature it has duped. By talking too much, he gives away the principle of violence and injustice underlying discourse and provokes in the feared adversary the very action he fears. So, he provokes in the feared adversary the very action that he fears. So, this is what Odysseus is trying to do. But by doing so, by becoming the parody of nature, then Odysseus brings on himself automatically the same violence that nature inflicts on him. To boast that he is Odysseus is almost like an attempt to actively bring Poseidon's anger on him. If you blame X for doing Y on you, and you want them to have a taste of their medicine, then you become X to do Y to X. But then since you become X, then you must apply on yourself the same violence you blamed X for doing to you. So in short, you do to yourself what X was doing to you. So Odysseus does the same violence on himself that he did to Polyphemus. The cunning sly fox must expiate his sins against the nature he has been duping. And so that's why Odysseus, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is kind of a Jewish figure. He is the middleman on whom all of the woes of civilization are blamed because he cheated some higher power. So the Jew, and this is something we will explore in the fifth chapter of the book, The Elements of Anti-Semitism, the Jew is a middleman. The merchant who hijacks prices, who cheats you in bargains and negotiations. So he becomes the vessel, the scapegoat for humanity's cunning, cheating nature for thousands of years. Eudeus, who compulsively proclaims himself to be Odysseus, already bears features of the Jew, who in fear of death continues to boast of a superiority which itself stems from the fear of death. Revenge on the middleman stands not only at the end of bourgeois society, but at its beginning, as the negative utopia towards which coercive violence tends in all its forms. So, reason, speech, technology, all of the products of enlightenment are basically people doing to people what nature was doing to people. It is nature's revenge. The violence we experience through progress is a revenge of the siren's songs. is the revenge of the eye of Polyphemus and the revenge of Circe, to whom we now turn. So the next section is about the encounters that Odysseus had with female characters. In the Odyssey, Circe and Odysseus had an affair and she turned his companions into pigs. So what's the meaning of this story according to Adorno and Horkheimer? Well, Circe is a figure that is directly linked to the magical stage, precisely to what magic does to the self. It disintegrates it into oblivion. So by turning Odysseus' companions into pigs, she literally disintegrates their sense of self and pushes them down to the state of animals and basic instinct. So what seems to make the difference between man and animal is that man has a sense of self. To lose that is the worst form of regress that can happen to a human being. Among that regress, there is the literal transformation of humans into animals, but also sexuality. Circe isn't just a sorceress, she is also a seducer. Her weapons aren't just spells, but also sexuality. But like the Sirens and Polyphemus, Odysseus cannot escape their world only through their own rules. And therefore, when the god Hermes sends Odysseus to Circe, he warns him not to resist temptation. Rather, Odysseus must find a way to maintain his self while undergoing the process of regress. To quote from the Odyssey, and this is Hermes talking to Odysseus, "She will shrink from you in terror and invite you to her bed, nor must you hesitate to accept the goddess's favors." So how can Odysseus deal with this new threat? If we can call this a threat. First, we need to understand what Circe is, or what's her signature power. According to the authors, Circe's signature move is ambiguity. Quote, "She appears by turns as corrupter and helper. Ambiguity is expressed even in her lineage. She is the daughter of Helios and the granddaughter of Okeanos." So Helios in Greek mythology he's the deity personifying the sun, and Okeanos is the father of all rivers and is the titan that personifies the oceans. So in relation to what we said in the first section of the concept of enlightenment, if you remember, we said that the first generations of deities were not separate from their elements. So this is another emphasis on the old as opposed to the new, and a further emphasis on the magical stage. The lineage of Circe therefore highlights these two aspects, like in Polyphemus. She represents the past and magic, and in those two aspects, the most fundamental characteristic is ambiguity. We don't really understand what Circe really is. Being the daughter of the sun and the granddaughter of the oceans, she is made of two opposite elements, fire and water. And so the intertwinement of these two elements in Circe makes her the seductress that she is. She is represented as a courtesan, a prostitute. Her indeterminacy, quote, "constitutes the essence of promiscuity and of the courtesan, reappearing as a watery lunar reflection even in the gaze of the 19th century prostitute. The hetera both bestows joy and destroys the autonomy of its recipient." So the note there is a reference to a poem by Baudelaire in his collection Les Fleurs du Mal. The poem is Le vin du solitaire, the wine of the lonely man. It's about a prostitute, and so the narrator is describing a prostitute's eyes as she looks at him. Le regard singulier d'une femme galante qui se glisse vers nous comme le rayon blanc que la lune onduleuse envoie au lac tremblant quand elle y veut baigner sa beauté nonchalante. So he's talking about how the look of a prostitute slides towards them like the beam of a moonlight slides on a lake and reflects the moonlight on the water. So the poet is like the lake, and she has her eyes on him and wants to bathe in him. So basically, she is seducing him, like casting a spell on him, and that spell makes him feel powerless, like he cannot resist her. And the word hetera means courtesan, so her ambiguity lies in this. She can bring joy and destroy the subject simultaneously. But following the thesis of a classicist who is mentioned by Adorno and Horkheimer, J.A.K. Thompson about Circe, the authors say that she doesn't really destroy the recipient, like you don't really die, but rather you regress to an older form of life. Those who fall under her spell simply becomes animals. They become animals, sorry. They revert to an older stage of life, one without a sense of self. And so this makes her closer to the Lotus Eaters than to Polyphemus, since like the Lotus Eaters, Circe doesn't really harm those who fall under her spell. Even those who are turned into wild beasts like lions and wolves don't attack Odysseus or his companions, but they just behave like pets. As they write, the bewitched humans behave in a similar way to the wild animals which listen to the playing of Orpheus. Now, Orpheus was a legendary mythical poet who turns wild animals into peaceful pets with his songs. So the spells of Circe are about reconciliation. Through magic and sexuality, the nature within the individuals is liberated from suppression. Individuals in magic and pleasure can experience their instincts without the destructive connotation of instinct. So what civilization teaches is that what distinguishes man from beast is that man can repress his instinct. And once he does, his sense of self emerges. So in the state of nature, which is often represented as a hopeless cycle, human beings can never constitute themselves since their instincts control them. But with Circe, which according to Adorno and Horkheimer, the name Circe can allude to the cycle of nature. With her, the instincts are liberated, and those under her spell can live in an ideal of reconciliation. Yet the same thing happened to the Lotus Eaters. The reconciliation in question is certainly illusory, and so we suppress even more. The revolutionary potential of reconciliation is again neutralized here. Homer makes sure that this state in which humans turn into animal is understood as a calamity without even explaining why. Like it's just bad. Because they were once men, the civilizing epic cannot present their fate as anything other than a calamitous lapse. And in Homer's account, there is hardly a trace of the pleasure which went with it. It is all the more emphatically expunged the more civilized the victims themselves are. So the note mentions Gilbert Murray again, who argues that it's probable that later editions of Homer's text, because we don't have the actual text written by Homer. Ancient texts were preserved by scribes who make several copies over and over again. So through the centuries, it's possible that changes were made to the epic. And so Murray argues that some of the changes may have been the expurgation of sexual notions. Like whomever edited the text really wanted to tone down the emphasis on sexuality so that no one really sees this state as desirable. Even the companions of Odysseus don't even get to become lions or eagles, animals that inspire, might and freedom, but they turn into pigs. Here Adorno and Horkheimer offer many interpretations of why the story makes the crew turn into pigs. Like what do pigs represent? So it can be a reference to the cult of Demeter. According to Wilamowitz, the pig is a sacrificial animal for Demeter, and Demeter is a chthonic deity, so in relation to the earth. So maybe the pig means that you have brought yourself down to the earth. Another explanation is that the pig and the human are alike. Both are naked creatures, like they don't have fur, and so the pigs refer to a state of interspecies mating. So reverting back to magic means that people would have sex with animals. So to mingle blood between animals and humans is a big taboo found in both Greek and Jewish culture in relation to pigs. And so the pig can also represent a state of cannibalism. The authors mention the Roman author Juvenal, who repeatedly asserted that the flesh of human beings have similar taste to that of pigs. In short, they write, at any rate, later civilizations have always linked to apply the name of pig or swine to anyone whose impulses tended towards other pleasures than those sanctioned by society for its purposes. So the choice of the pig is a device to make people simply disgusted by the idea of reconciliation, abundance, art, and pleasure, especially sexual pleasure. And so all of these ideas are stained with the fear of relapsing into prehistory. In a footnote, they mention Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Well, actually, they refer to the 21st volume of Freud's complete work, page 99, and more specifically to the footnote on that page, but it is from Civilization and its Discontents, and it is the first footnote of the fourth part of the book. And so in it, Freud explains his speculative theory. He says in the footnote that this is a speculation. He explains that when men got erected on both legs, our relation to sex began to change. Before we got on two legs, genitals were hidden, and so we had to rely on olfactive stimulation in order to get aroused. Men just had to smell menstruation of women since we cannot see the genitals. But once we got on both legs, now we can see the genitals. And from there, according to Freud, sexual stimulation became visual and therefore more frequent. But also when our genitals became exposed, we became more self-aware because everyone can see them. We had to hide them with clothes. And from there, we began to experience guilt and shame. So in the context of Adorno, that guilt and shame about sexual desires is also related to the fact that we were once animals, and therefore everything sexual bears the memory of prehistory, of a time where human beings were still animals. So if you want sex, then you have to be a pig. Being an animal means that you are a creature of smell. And so human beings focus on sight rather than smell, because with your eyes you perceive more than with your nose. Your eyes are turned toward what is far, towards the horizon, towards the sky. You can cover more with sight, but on the other hand, smell needs to be close to the earth. You must remain low and only perceive what is close to you. So the pig is the perfect image of this, since its big snout in the middle of its face makes him always look down to sniff the ground. And so the image of the pig refers to the idea that one is constantly turned towards the ground in order to sniff. The pig's nose is a characteristic of its essence. It represents regress in its ultimate form, since it is at the complete opposite of posture. As they write, in the image of the pig, however, the joy of scent is distorted into the unfree snuffling of someone who has his nose to the ground and has renounced the upright posture. They also point in a footnote where Wilamowitz linked sniffing to nous, autonomous reason, but they don't really explain more about that. So anyways, we don't need to go into that. The point of this is to argue that what Circe is doing to the men confirms that Circe is bad news and must be subjugated by the man somehow. Homer's depiction of Circe's spell and its consequences say that she is like confirming the fears of the patriarchy, which justifies her subjugation. Women must see themselves like Circe as sorceress courtesans, and we must find a way to neutralize their primitive powers. Like her, women are predisposed under the pressure of civilization to adopt its judgment on women and to denigrate sex. So the neutralization was already within the ambiguous nature of Circe. Being ambiguous like she is both fire and water, she is weakness and strength, both irresistible and powerless. Hence, it is through submitting to her that men disarm her. The wild beasts that roam around her place also serve as her protectors, which only highlights her fragility and vulnerability. So the way around her power is basically to become a protector. When someone guards another, the guard is submissive to the king or prince, but the presence of the guard suggests that the prince is weak, since he needs the guard. And so Circe represents nature. Like any woman in patriarchal society, she is irresistible with her charms and spells, but at the same time, she is powerless. That's why she shrinks in front of Odysseus and offers him her bed. Nature is also like that, apparently, and men need to find a way to dominate nature despite her irresistibility. In other words, they need her to reflect back the vain lie of power, which substitutes the mastery over nature for reconciliation with it. So we need to play her game and make reconciliation with her, with nature, the same as mastery over her and nature. So how can the patriarchy do that? How can men equate reconciliation with women with mastery over women? Well, the solution is marriage. As they say, marriage is society's middle way in dealing with this question. Woman remains powerless in that her power is mediated to her only through her husband. So marriage works like a contract exactly like that made between Odysseus and Polyphemus. So Odysseus makes an exchange with Circe. That exchange is the following. Already Odysseus resists Circe's magic. She herself admits that she cannot turn him into a pig like the rest of his crew, and says that he has a heart that cannot be enchanted. And so this already points to the idea that Odysseus has already hardened his sense of self enough, having been through the Lotus Eaters and Polyphemus. He has hardened his self enough to not be affected by Circe. But as we said, the point isn't to create a gap between the self and nature that cannot be bridged. Nature still has her rights to claim the self of Odysseus. So Odysseus still must submit to her if he wants to receive what nature promises. And so this is the point after all. As we said, that the contract made by men is to grant him access to nature's resources without losing the self. So Odysseus wants to have sex with Circe as long as it doesn't threaten his self. So he accepts with that condition. He makes her swear an oath that she won't take revenge on him for his male dominance over her and the ban on promiscuity. So nature doesn't want to be dominated and nature is all about promiscuity, but this threatens the integrity of the self, and therefore he makes her promise not to mutilate him in revenge. So although, as the authors point, the domination of the ban of promiscuity already mutilates the subject, Odysseus is already mutilated by the ban of promiscuity and his dominance over Circe. But Circe accepts and tells him to have sex with her so that they can trust each other. She tries to show him reconciliation through sexual pleasure after sexual pleasure was spurned, meaning looked at with contempt. So, Circe accepted the worldview that pleasure is bad, but when it is framed in a contract that guarantees the preservation of the self, then we can have it. However, this is a situation that she cannot win. Since she has to prove that she doesn't mean any harm, she will always have to give more than Odysseus. So Circe and Odysseus, they enter into a competition, each trying to dominate the other, right? But this domination, this mastery over each other, is hidden under the semblance of reconciliation. And so this is what love does to partners. Love as an ideology only hides the competition between the partners over domination. When you see a marriage picture, you seem to see two partners who are in a reconciled situation, but beneath the appearances, there is a whole battle over mastery. And at the same and that same mastery comes once love and of course sex were banned. Odysseus bans love and sex with Circe because it threatens the self that he loses anyways because of the ban. And now Circe has to find a way to prove that she is not going to destroy Odysseus. And so this becomes the meaning of love in bourgeois society. Love means deception. Odysseus loves Circe by deceiving her into getting her resources, and Circe loves Odysseus by deceiving him into protecting her. But then Circe loses because, well, she's the one who has to love more in order to prove that Odysseus can trust her. And as the authors say, in the word of exchange, the one who gives more is in the wrong, but the one who loves is always the one who loves more. So the point of exchange, that's the point of exchange, right? You want the other to give more while you give less. But that means that the one who gives more is the one who made the sacrifice and is therefore praised. The love who gives more makes the sacrifice. Man has cheated the goddess because now it is the goddess who has to sacrifice to the man. If you love someone, you must sacrifice yourself for them. You must give more than you take. So the one who is glorified is the one who is wrong, the one who suffers more, the one who is oppressed the most, the one who inflicts on himself the worst possible violence, the self-mutilated, is the sacred model for society. And so in the end, neither Odysseus nor Circe experience love. Each tries to enslave the other, tries to cheat the other into giving more, and so instead they experience a form of love that makes them both criminals that deserve punishment, that deserve isolation. Quote, with society, loneliness reproduces itself on a wider scale. The mechanism operates even within the tenderest ramifications of feeling until love itself, in order to have contact with another person at all, is forced to assume such coldness that it shatters at the moment of its realization. So, marriage bans love and sex precisely because of this. It is a disenchanted contract that empties love of its power and its revolutionary potential. What Circe is reduced to is a prophetess that betrays the other female characters. It is Circe who warned Odysseus about the sirens, about Scylla and Charybdis. And yes, Scylla and Charybdis are also female monsters. The powers of the sorceress only serve male self-preservation by giving away the secret to defeat the other female characters. So once Circe is defeated, sexuality is now regulated, and the resources of nature are now available for men without the risk of losing themselves. Marriage is, at heart, a contract that guarantees the self of the partners when granting them access to each other's resources. But it's usually the man's access to the woman's resources. And so this victory is conveyed, according to the authors, by the passage in the epic when Circe transforms the man back. Now that sex is regulated, that men are brought back, not like they were when they turned into pigs, but they are brought back into their prime of manhood. Quote, they not only became men again, but looked younger and much handsomer and taller than before. And they all wept with happiness. The authors argue that maybe this is the origins of the song ceremonies in marriage. We celebrate the man's victory over nature, which leads him to the peak of manhood. And so Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is therefore not so different from Circe and Calypso. Calypso is another sea goddess that Odysseus had sex with, but the authors only mention her. They don't analyze Odysseus' relationship with Calypso, they only focus on Circe. Anyway, so the point is to draw this parallel between marriage and prostitution to suggest that both are contemporary forms of female self-alienation under the patriarchy. Like wife and harlot, another name for prostitute, are accomplices. As they write, the wife betrays pleasure to the fixed order of life and property, while the harlot, as her secret accomplice, brings within the property relationship that which the wife's property rights do not include pleasure by selling it. So what this means is that both wife and harlot are neutralized forms of pleasure. The wife denies pleasure since her role is only to bring children. Sexuality is confined to the purpose of making babies to inherit the capital of the father. So the wife alienates herself to have access to the husband's property. She is making an exchange, and her exchange preserves her only if no one else but her husband can have sex with her. And so the harlot who gives pleasure has to neutralize it through monetary exchange, having to sell pleasure's emancipatory potential is neutralized. So both wife and harlot are even mimicking one another. As the authors point, the harlots are also weavers, like housewives, but also has mythical powers of fate. The weaver in mythology is an entity that weaves the webs of fate. And so the image here refers to the power that sexuality and nature have on men. And likewise, Penelope acts like Circe when she distrusts Odysseus when he returns home. She's like, how can you prove to me that you are really my husband and not some beggar or god who wants to have his way with me? And so it is also worth noting that Penelope uses her weaver talents to keep the suitors away from marrying her. Like she told them that once she finishes her weaving, she'll marry one of them, but every night she undoes the weaving that she did during the day, so that the next morning she'd be like, hey, I didn't finish yet. Anyway, so Penelope has to make sure that the guy standing in front of her is indeed Odysseus. And so she is trying everything to avoid committing a mistake. She looks at his face and she sees the face of Odysseus, and then looks at his clothes and sees the clothes of a stranger. So she doesn't let herself get overwhelmed with her emotions. If she gives in to her emotion, then the social order will crumble. Only her husband can have pleasure with her, without which the rules of society break down and it's the return to barbarism. And as such, the wife also becomes the male. There is an inversion of the gender roles in that scene, because Penelope acts like Odysseus acted with Circe, while Telemachus, the son of Odysseus and Penelope, blames his mother for not trusting the man standing in front of her. Is Odysseus. So Telemachus acts like Circe, trying to convince his mother to trust him. But that's because, Telemachus isn't fully developed yet. According to the authors, he didn't adapt himself completely to his future position as the next patriarch. So in other words, the wife is a step further than the harlot, because the wife must alienate herself even more from nature to the point of becoming male herself. If the Hatira makes the patriarchal world order her own, the monogamous wife is not satisfied even with this and cannot rest until she has made herself conform to the male character. So indeed, Penelope, like Odysseus, is known for her cunning. Like we mentioned, how she tricked the suitors and buys time till Odysseus comes back. So when Odysseus arrives, she uses a trick to know if he really is her husband. She tells him to move her bed, but Odysseus refuses. He knows that the bed cannot be moved because he made that bed. The bed is unmovable, which also symbolizes that his marriage with Penelope is unmovable as well. In the epic, Odysseus says that there used to be an olive tree in their bedroom, and he made the bed around the olive tree, and he even integrated the tree into the bed. And this information, only Odysseus has it. So the man standing there has to be her husband. So the idea that the bed is related to an olive tree is significant. The olive tree symbolizes roots and therefore a fixed point, something that cannot be moved or altered. Like Odysseus, throughout his journey, he has to remain the same. He must preserve his self. The tree then becomes a symbol of the unity between sex and property. The fact that Odysseus built the bed around the tree means that Odysseus is the landowner. The land is his property, and this ultimately alienates him from others, because the handiwork that Odysseus was doing to make his bed is that of a hobby. Odysseus wasn't working out of necessity like a slave. His work isn't for physical survival, but serves as a social marker. Odysseus has servants, right? That's how he can own property. He has other people working on it. So what he does is free work, which puts him in a higher position in the social hierarchy. And it is also this that helps Penelope recognize her husband. Quote, "He enjoys his occupation, as his freedom to perform superfluous tasks confirms his power over those who have to do such work in order to live." By this, the ingenious Penelope recognizes him, flattering him with praise of his exceptional intelligence. So this means that only those who own property can have access to sex, because only them can resist its temptation. So like with the sirens, only Odysseus can listen to the songs because he is chained. He won't go to them, he won't go to the sirens. Slaves and workers, on the other hand, shouldn't listen to the songs. Only those who cannot enjoy it can have it. And then Penelope says something strange, which brings another aspect to marriage. It's not just that marriage neutralizes sexuality and asserts the mutilated self even more, it does something else. She wonders why the gods try to separate them. Like Penelope wants nothing more than enjoy her marriage with Odysseus and grow old together, but since everything that happened was the doing of the gods, she asks why the gods can let people experience the joy of marriage in youth and grow old together. Probably because the gods are immortal, so they don't grow old. So now the story is about death. Following Penelope, death is another thing that marriage tries to neutralize. Marriage represents not only the account-balancing order of the living, but also solidarity and steadfastness in face of death. So Adorno and Horkheimer quote the German writer Goethe, who said that the point of marriage is to confirm the concept of permanence. The authors interpret this as a neutralization of death. And so how does that happen? Well, Homer uses the same process as in love. As we said, the concept of love in patriarchal society is a fetish that hides the sexual struggles within marriages. You take the barbaric competition for power between partners and you put it in a human value. Marriage is about love and stability to hide the battle between Odysseus and Circe underneath it, the social realities of the sexes. So marriage is the progressive form of barbaric practices like the epic is to myth. And so the hearth of the home is also a progressive form of the altar of sacrifice. If the contract between the spouses set aside the old hostility only with difficulty, nevertheless the couple aging in peace merges into the image of Philemon and Baucis, as the smoke from the sacrificial altar is transmuted into that rising beneficently from the hearth. So Philemon and Baucis are two mythical figures in Greek mythology. They are regular people, an old married couple who welcomed Zeus and Hermes once. Like Zeus and Hermes dressed up as poor beggars, and they went to the humans to see if they respect the value of hospitality, but only Philemon and Baucis did. So they killed everyone except those two. And since then, Philemon and Baucis became the symbol of marriage in Greek mythology. Like marriage is supposed to be the first move towards civilization, the first act that gets us out of the state of nature and from myth. So Odysseus and Penelope become like Philemon and Baucis as they grow old, and likewise the sacrificial altar becomes the hearth of the home. So the old barbaric practices are painted with human values, if you want. That is the meaning of progress, and that's what happens to death as well. So Odysseus goes to Hades in the Odyssey. He journeys into the realm of the dead in book 11. It's the underworld to talk with the dead, precisely with the seer Tiresias. It was Circe who told Odysseus to meet Tiresias because Tiresias knows the way back home to Ithaca. But what is interesting is that when he goes there, some of the figures that he meets are matriarchal figures. The images which appear to the adventurer in the first visit to the underworld are of matriarchal shades who have been banished by the religion of light. So the underworld is the first place associated with femininity. Death and women are alike. They are threats to the integrity of the male character, the sense of self. The first figure that he sees is his mother, Anticlea, who died while waiting for his return. But in the underworld, it is not really the people that you meet, but their shades or their shadows. Shades are basically empty shells of the person who once existed. They cannot talk to the living unless you offer them a blood sacrifice. The blood attracts the dead, and once they drink from it, you can talk with the dead. They can talk with the living once they drink from the blood. Before that, you cannot. Before that, they cannot even recognize who is talking to them. And I mean, at least Odysseus' mom doesn't recognize him, but Odysseus can't let her drink of the blood yet, because the blood is for Tiresias. And so no matter how much he wants to talk with his mother, his goal is to get the information from Tiresias of how to get home. It's like, you know, it's like a test. It's like, you know, the world is throwing to Odysseus, you know, the things that would arouse his emotions. Like, you know, you have the occasion to talk to your mother, and Odysseus, you know, loves his mother, but, you know, you have to resist. You have to resist talking to your mother, because you have to talk to Tiresias. You have only enough blood to make one sacrifice to talk to just one, either Tiresias or your mother. And so no matter how much he wants to talk with his mother, his goal is to get the information. So the authors interpret this as Odysseus having to keep a patriarchal stance towards his mother, towards the matriarch. So he must remain pragmatic and rational even in this situation, because of what is in front of him. What is in front of him, isn't even his real mother, but an image of his mother. Like, don't get deceived by images. Like, enlightenment despises images, because the image of a thing is not the same as the thing, right? We said many times that enlightenment wants to distinguish things and what signifies them. And so this is, again, the separation between signs, images, and things that we see in Enlightenment thought. People must not confuse the image with the actual thing, otherwise they will fall back into superstition. So Odysseus' resistance to talk to his own mother is also a resistance to return to the archaic world of images and illusions. So his mother is rendered speechless, powerless, and blind like a phantom, because that's what an image is. Death, Hades, isn't really the realm of the dead, but the realm of images with archaic and primitive people, which archaic and primitive people confuse with reality. Enlightened men, progress, is precisely the opposite of this. So Hades represents the past, the realm of disempowered myths. And Odysseus must maintain the largest distance with them. That's why Hades is located at the furthest reaches of the world. But as we said, what can kill you also makes you stronger. So the fact that Hades is at the end of the world means that you must go there. You must go to what kills you, because that's how you become stronger. You cannot avoid, as we said, the forces of nature. So the hero must go to where his sense of self can be destroyed and then emerges from it stronger. Just like the men, when they were transformed back into humans by Circe, they emerged stronger and younger. So Odysseus must go to the underworld in order to become more himself and conquer the underworld. The point of katabasis, meaning the journey to the underworld, is to come back stronger than before. And so its point is precisely to transcend the old, to progress, to transcend myth. So the authors mentioned the thesis of the classical scholar Kirchhoff, I think that's how it is pronounced, who argued that Book 11 of the Odyssey is perhaps the oldest fragment of the epic, which suggests that the basis for the epic is precisely this idea of transcending myth. They also mention the journeys of other heroes like Heracles and Orpheus. Both went to the underworld to retrieve something from it. Heracles went to accomplish one of his 12 labors. It was to bring Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding Hades, and Orpheus went back to get his wife Eurydice. So anti-mythical attitudes are thus basis for progress. To be anti-myth is to look for ways to abolish death, to seek permanence. As Adorno and Horkheimer write, indeed the motive of forcing the gates of hell, of abolishing death, is the innermost cell of all mythological thought. Like we said, Homer's Pan-Hellenistic sentiments come from the desire of reconciliation between not just man and nature, but also between the Greek city-states. What divides people and lead them to fight one another, thus maintaining them in a state of nature, is myth. So the way out is to reconcile the gods. The journey of Odysseus is to appease the anger of Poseidon in an anti-mythical way. Like the prophecy that Tiresias gives Odysseus reveals this anti-mythical reconciliation, because he tells Odysseus, quote, to even wander even farther, carrying on his shoulder an oar until he reaches a people who know nothing of the sea and never use salt with their food. When he meets another traveler who refers to an oar on his shoulder as a winnowing fan, he will have reached the proper place to offer a sacrifice to Poseidon. So that's how Odysseus can appease the anger of Poseidon. He must make a sacrifice in a place that is so cut off from the sea that even the inhabitants won't know what an oar is. They will confuse it with a winnowing fan. And so this sounds like a joke, and probably Homer thought it is comical, someone seeing you carrying an oar on your shoulder and thinking it a fan is, well, I guess it's funny, apparently. And the point of the story, according to the authors, is that Poseidon finds this funny too, and through laughter, he will calm the fuck down, he will chill. And so humor is giving this ability to reconcile, as the authors also mention in a footnote, the nature of Poseidon. Apparently Poseidon only became a sea god later, but at first he was the husband of the earth. So at an earlier stage, it is posited that Poseidon was also a chthonic deity like Demeter. Tiresias' prophecy may be an allusion to this twofold nature. It is conceivable that his propitiation by means of an earthly sacrifice far away from any sea implies a symbolic restoration of his chthonic power, the chthonic power of Poseidon. This restoration might refer to the superseding of the sea voyage in search of booty by agriculture. The cults of Poseidon and Demeter merged. So it is also a reconciliation of the twofold nature of Poseidon as well. The reconciliation is done by making Poseidon laugh. The authors also mention a legend from German folklore that you find in the famous brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were two folklorists known for compiling all the legends and folktale they could find, Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, etc. All of these stories, they became popular because of them, and so there is among the folk tales, there is the story of about changelings. Now, a changeling is an offspring of elves that is annoying and ugly, and elves would usually kidnap normal kids and place the changeling in its place. So in this story, in a story, there is a mother that asks a neighbor how to get rid of the changeling, and the neighbor tells her to make the changeling laugh by boiling water in eggshells. That is supposed to be funny. And so she does that, and the changeling, seeing the woman boiling the water in eggshells, is like, this woman is crazy, and starts laughing. And when he does, the elves appear and take him back while giving the mother her kid back. Another example is mentioned. In a footnote about Demeter and the origins of her cult in Eleusis. Demeter has a famous cult known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. It's near Athens, and apparently the story goes that she went there looking for Persephone, her daughter. We mentioned this myth before. Now Persephone was kidnapped by Hades, and so Demeter went looking for her. She was sad and weeping and refused to touch the food that the Eleusinians presented her. She was, welcomed again by a married couple. Desilis and his wife Baulo, I think that's how it is pronounced, and Baulo suddenly exposed her body to her and made the meter laugh. The Greeks were fond of Michael Scott's humor, I guess, and so the myth is taken from Freud's short article, a mythical parallel to a visual obsession, and so in it, it's in the Complete Works of Freud, volume 14. In the article, Freud discusses a patient who has an image of his father as being just an ass with arms and legs, and calls it Father Arse, which Freud interprets as a joke, and it's a play on the word patriarch. And so the patient sees in his father like high moral standards, as a patriarch should have, but his father also has debauchery tendencies. So it's like in the joke Father Arse, you reconcile both aspects, the moral standards and the debauchery. And so the point of these stories is, according to the authors, to show the ambivalence of laughter. On the other hand, laughter can be an outburst of violence from nature, but at the same time, it can make nature abjure or renounce to her violence. And so Adorno and Horkheimer even mention a theory that names are perhaps petrified laughter. When we name something, it's apparently to make it renounce its violence, and therefore we can be reconciled with it. They say that practice persists with nicknames. A nickname is often humorous and is supposed to be linked not arbitrarily to the individual, so probably all names started as nicknames during the magical stage and had a comedic purpose. But although it's not clear how laughter was used during magical stages, in the stage of myth and the epic, the kind of reconciliation it seeks is the one we mentioned with Circe, Polyphemus, and sacrifice. It is, as they say, in league with the guilt of subjectivity. Quote, it promises a passage to the homeland. It is a yearning for the homeland which sets in motion the adventures by which subjectivity, the prehistory of which is narrated in the Odyssey, escapes the primeval world. So here the point of laughter, it seems, is to escape the primeval world, which is the escape from the mythical world to establish a homeland. We make the gods laugh, and in exchange, they leave us alone. So the very concept of a homeland is a rejection of the past, of myth, of the nomadic lifestyle. The nomadic lifestyle implies transformation and mimesis. As humans move from one place to another, they mimic their new environment, contrary to the settlement mentality where the environment must mimic the individual. But then, once the individual has cut themselves off from nature, once they establish the concept of property, if you want a homeland, you are going to need property. Otherwise, a homeland won't make any sense. So, anyways, once you do that, human beings start feeling alienated. When they establish property, they experience an alienation, which is a longing of or a homesickness. You want to return to the primeval world of nomadism, like when the savage child is taken out of the jungle and lives in the village. He has homesickness. He misses the jungle in which he didn't have a home. You know, he didn't have a home in the jungle, that's the point, but he feels homesick when he gets a home outside of the jungle. So our feeling of alienation in settlement is a homesickness of a time where we didn't have a homeland. But then the epic subverts that homesickness and makes it about the desire to return to the homeland. Odysseus in reality doesn't want to go back to Ithaca, but to the world of myth. But the epic makes the opposite claim, that Odysseus' homesickness stems from his alienation, not from nature, but from his property in Ithaca. But in reality, his homesickness stems from his alienation from nature, not from his home in Ithaca. So, for Adorno and Horkheimer, there cannot be an original lost state, like some sort of Eden that we will have to return to. Here, they say something important. They say Novalis' definition, according to which all philosophy is homesickness, holds good only if this longing is not dissipated in the phantasm of a lost original state, but homeland and nature itself are pictured as something that have had first to be wrestled from myth. Homeland is a state of having escaped. So what does this mean? Well, let's start with Novalis. Now, Novalis was a German romantic poet and philosopher who is famous for providing one of the best definitions of philosophy, I guess. He said that philosophy is homesickness and the desire to be at home everywhere in the world. So when people do philosophy, what they are trying to do is to find their home, to make the whole world their home. And as such, the philosopher is always seeking a home. So this definition is found in a fragment by Novalis. More precisely, it's fragment 45 in his general draft. You will find it in a book called Physical Writings by Novalis, edited by Margaret Stoljar. Anyway, so for Novalis, we are constantly in a state of homesickness from which there is no escape. So for the longing to be at home, for the longing to be at home to make sense, then it cannot be about the phantasm of a lost original state. You can even compare this with what he says about the self, what Novalis says about the self in relation to education and philosophy in another fragment, fragment 3. He says that the self has no beginning, but what is the fascism in Homer? That's what the fascism in Homer argues for, that there is a beginning for the self which starts in a homeland. The homeland is the original state in which the self can begin, where Odysseus can find his firmness. But that state must be wrested from myth. And so this is the thinking of enlightenment. What is preventing us from finding our homeland is myth. It's irrationality. It is obsession, it's obsolete belief, in the supernatural. Even nature, for the fascist, can exist only if it is wrested, if it is pulled violently from myth. So traditional philosophy has been following that path to establish a homeland. It seeks to familiarize us with the world, to disenchant the world and nature. But philosophy, according to the authors, must do the opposite, to defamiliarize us with nature and not escape from it. And as such, homeland is a state of having escaped the mythical world. But given that there is no escaping myth, homeland is itself a myth. What is mythical is the homeland. To think that we can escape myth, that is a myth. And what Homer didn't want, what Homer did, wasn't to take human beings out of myth, but he transposed myth into civilization. For this reason, the criticism that the Homeric legends withdraw from the earth is a warranty of their myth. They turn to men. So that is an allusion to Hölderlin, another famous German romantic poet, and specifically they refer to his poem Autumn. In it he says that the legends that used to be about the earth have departed and turned to men. What this means is that myths and legends are like the seasons. They will return. You think that you have transcended them, but no, they will come back. You have disenchanted the world, you have disenchanted the earth, but now the myths, now they became about men. They're no longer about the earth, about how the cosmos. They're no longer about explaining seasons, but they will return to explain human behavior. Okay, so they are eternal. Civilization is like summer that thought that it had escaped from winter. By disenchanting nature, summer thinks that winter will no longer exist, but then myth returns, like autumn. So human beings have not escaped from ghosts, demons, and spirits. Those entities will eventually return like the seasons. And so the point is that now men will act out on those myths and legends. They will continue the cycle of nature within the walls of civilization and bring down the progress that they created. Like we didn't satisfy myth, as they say. We dragged it into the sphere of time. Every civilization will now cause its own demise, and it's only a question of time before the goddesses of vengeance destroy it. So vengeance is the vengeance of civilization on the primeval world, like the violence that the authors witnessed in the 20th century was basically civilization, mankind wanting to take revenge over the nature that oppressed them a long time ago. But that same vengeance can also be the vengeance of the primeval world on civilization. So civilization avenges the primeval world by inflicting on itself the worst kind of violence that maybe the primeval world wouldn't commit. And so civilization then is no different from the myth that it claims to have escaped from. Quote, the vengeance wreaked by civilization on the primeval world has been terrible, and in this vengeance the most horrifying document of which in Homer is to be found in the account of the mutilation of the goatherd Melanthios. Civilization itself resembles the primeval world. So Melanthios is a minor character in the Odyssey. He is a goatherd of Odysseus, so the guy is responsible for the goats. So he's a servant. Melanthios is a servant of Odysseus, and he is a traitor who was siding with the suitors. And so when Odysseus comes back disguised as a beggar, Melanthios actually beats him. But at the end, Melanthios gets tortured in the most inhumane way. In Book 22, which is the chapter where Odysseus kills the suitors and the servants who betrayed him, Melanthios' sister gets hanged. Melanthios gets his nose and ears cut off, he gets his genitals chopped off and fed to the dogs, and then the dogs eat his hand and feet. It's really gruesome. And about his sister, she got hanged along with 11 other women because they were maid servants who disrespected Penelope and were getting freaky with the suitors. And what's funny is that Odysseus and Telemachus made them clean the bodies of the suitors after they killed them, and the description is very graphic. And then they had to clean the whole room, and once they did, he hanged them all. Like that's gangsta, right? And it is this sort of violence that makes civilization and the primeval world so alike when civilization tries to escape that world. The mutilation of Melanthios and the maidservants, that level of violence is inflicted on the primeval world to send it to its death. But it is not the violence itself that allows civilization to transcend the mythical world, but the way the violence is narrated. Like the violent deed is itself the primeval world. It's not Melanthios that represents the primeval world, but Melanthios and the violence that he undergoes from Odysseus and Telemachus. So it's not just Melanthios that must be banished to the underworld, but the violence itself. Therefore, civilization is aware of itself as similar to the primeval world, and therefore it seeks a way to put some distance from that violence while perpetrating it. And so this is where speech comes in again. Speech allows civilization to remember that violence from the past without succumbing to it, like Odysseus with the sirens. He hears the song, remembers it, but doesn't get enchanted by it. Hence, he escapes death. Speech itself, language, as opposed to mythical song, the possibility of holding fast to the past atrocity through memory, is the law of Homeric escape. So this is why the epic is closer to prose and the novel than to song and poetry. With song you are enchanted, you give in to feelings and emotions, to mythical violence. But in the epic, it's like the novel, it is distant narration. Odysseus himself is described as a great narrator as he tells his story to King Alcinous. The cold detachment of narrative which describes even the horrible as if for entertainment, for the first time reveals in all their clarity the horrors which in song are solemnly confused with fate. So the epic is known for its great emphasis on detailed anatomy. It is a realist depiction, like in novels where you have vivid but detached description of everything in a scene. This detachment allows civilization to escape death by preventing itself to be moved or affected by the violence that it seeks to perpetrate. So the totalizing aspect of speech through description is the basis for scientific language, which is reassuring due to its detachment from the object that it describes. As long as speech runs, death is kept at bay, even within the walls of civilization through memory. So the ultimate scene is that of the maidservants hanging, which the authors find puzzling, especially with the line that describes their death. For a little while, their feet kicked out, but not for very long. So the first part is about the description of the women's feet kicking out as they are being choked to death by the ropes. The description is about, the dooming of the women to go down the realm of Hades, from which Odysseus, the judge, Odysseus is the one who judged those women, he escaped from that realm. And so in that moment, we see the intertwinement of barbarism and culture, which the authors also discuss in relation to Wilamowitz in a footnote. Like civilization carries within the barbaric realm of death, and it tries to escape that realm through speech. The narrator and the reader look at the scene where the women are twitching and gasping for air, hoping that speech will keep the moment of their actual death at bay. However, that moment of death is coming, and so even there, the poet, the judge, and the narrator realize that there is no amount of speech that can keep death away. The woman cannot keep twitching forever, and so likewise, speech cannot go forever. And there are instances where speech is silent. And in those moments, they write, when speech goes silent, it causes to flash up a semblance of freedom that civilization has been unable wholly to extinguish ever since. And so what is this freedom exactly? Well, it is the moment when death hits. The moment where the woman stops twitching and get down to the realm that civilization wants to forget without really forgetting. So their civilization needs its reassurance, which is provided by the second part of the line, not for very long. And so here Homer confronts himself to his, comforts himself and his readers. The moment that we fear so much didn't last long. Death will come, but will be gone quickly. Just one moment and it will all be over. We will all have escaped. And so here too, Adorno and Horkheimer, they mention Murray again, who it's in a footnote, and he highlights the comforting tone of the line. Murray argues that scenes of torture along scenes of sexuality have probably been edited out, and the ones who were left had to be comforting somehow. But that just means that we cannot forget that moment in which the maidens were fighting against death. And so there is a strange tone in Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis here. It's like they are saying that the maidens are taunting those who watch them die, like they refuse to die and go to Hades where the living can forget them. And so the civilized man wants to forget about death. He wants the maiden to die quickly so that they go down the underworld and remain there with the archaic religions, myths, and superstition. But in reality, the maidens are going to be remembered. They will lurk in the memory of civilization, becoming its shadows, and therefore make the similarity between civilization and Hades more apparent. This is why the authors say that not for long will turn into Quisque tendem. This is Latin. This is a Latin phrase from the Roman philosopher Cicero. So Cicero has this whole phrase. He says, hopefully I pronounced this right, Quisque tendem aduatere catilina paciencia nostra. And so it means, for how long are you going to test our patience, Catilina? So Catilina was a Roman senator and was an enemy of Cicero. he tried to plot against him to assassinate him and to overthrow the Roman Republic. So Cicero made a series of speeches against him, and in one of them he asks him, "How long are you going to test our patience?" And so Catilina here is like the maidens. They try the patience of civilization by refusing to die. And therefore the realm of Hades must be remembered only as a fairy tale or of something that existed long before in the past, as something that only barbaric people would do, and hopefully with the death of the woman and the suitors, it will not resurface again. So death is just remembered as a once upon a time. And so this is how they conclude the chapter. Over the raveled skein of history, of prehistory, barbarism and culture, Homer passes the soothing hand of remembrance, bringing the solace of once upon a time. Only as the novel is the epic transmuted into a fairy tale. And that's it. That's how the chapter ends. So the first excursus ends with that note. Only as the novel is the epic transmuted into fairy tale, because that's what the epic is doing. It is to transform all of these things that scare us so much into fairy tales, into, you know, something of once upon a time, so that, you know, we always keep our distance with them, and that's how we would win over them. That's the power of speech, after all. It is to keep Circe, it is to keep the Lotus Eaters, it is to keep Polyphemus and Hades at bay. And we will see that in the next excursus, so we will start reading it next week. How this, because in the second excursus they will jump into Juliet. So Juliet is a novel by Marquis de Sade, who is a figure of enlightenment, and they will show how this keeping away from myth, from magic, and all of that, from the things that challenge rationality, they will also be going to be applied to morality itself. And once you see morality as itself a myth, well, it is kind of the gateway to treating people as really objects. And we will see how Juliet does precisely that. So thank you for watching. I hope that you find this very useful. And well, as always, thank you for watching.